is a public health expert, a good addition to the Senate. Welcome to Future Hindsight, where we take big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. Because democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. I'm Mila Atmos. Our guest is Abdul El-Sayed. He is a doctor, public health expert, and candidate for U.S. Senate in Michigan. He rebuilt Detroit's health department after bankruptcy, then restructured the Wayne County Department of Health, serving 1.8 million residents with initiatives like securing free glasses for kids, removing lead from schools, and spearheading a program canceling $700 million in medical debt. He served as the director of the Department of Health, Human and Veteran Services for Wayne County in Michigan from 2023 to 2025. He's also the author of Medicare for All, a citizen's guide, and a Biden Unity Task Force member. And before we start, if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, please leave us a review on your podcast app. Whether you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere in between, it really goes a long way for other listeners to discover our show. Thank you. Welcome, Abdul. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Honored to be here.
So you're a physician, and I've heard you say that you didn't think you'd ever be a politician, and yet here you are running for Senate. Tell us what prompted you to decide to run and why we need a candidate like you right now.
Well, it's the same thing that took me to medical school. I was raised by my father, who's an Egyptian immigrant, and my stepmom, Jackie, who's a daughter of the American Revolution from the middle of the state of Michigan. And growing up in a house like that, you get exposed to so many different ways of living. My summers would have me shipped out to Egypt with whatever family was going to hang out with my grandmother, smartest, wisest person I ever met in my life, my Teta Soad. She never got to go to school. She was the 9th of 14, raised in a time and a place where, however brilliant she clearly was, she never got that opportunity. She herself gave birth to 8 kids. 6 of them survived their first birthday. 2 of them died before they turned 1 year old. And I would spend this time with this just incredibly brilliant human being who understood that the one thing I had going for me more than any of my other cousins was opportunity. I remember being 13 years old, and when you go abroad, you take a lot of gifts. And so I was like some combination of like a 13-year-old punk from America and Santa Claus. So like I remember handing out my gifts, and I was kind of felt some kind of way. And my grandmother pulled me aside, points to one of my cousins. That one's smarter than you. Well, the one there, taller and better looking, but I didn't have to tell you. That third one works harder than you do. That one's nicer than you are. And I remember at some point, like I'm a puddle on the floor now, and she's like, "But you have the most important thing." I was like, "What's that?" She said, "You get to go back to America at the end of the summer." So in the 15 hours that I would travel between Egypt and where I grew up in the United States, I'd travel a 10-year life expectancy gap. I could go 15 minutes from where I grew up into the city of Detroit or in the city of Pontiac, and I would travel the same 10-year life expectancy gap. And I became a doctor to do something about that. And as I graduated medical school in New York City, came to realize that the healthcare system I was training to become a part of was not only not part of the solution, it was actually part of the problem. Watched as people who deserved the healthcare that they needed get chewed up and spit out by a system that was more interested in making sure that we could monetize their illness. And I made a decision at the end of medical school to forego residency training and instead go into public health. I got to rebuild health departments, got to do things like put glasses on kids, take on big corporate polluters, eliminate medical debt. But so many of the challenges we face sit downstream of a politics that tells us that a corporation's interests matter more than the well-being of the people that our government is supposed to serve. And so I think so much of what I've been trying to do around keeping people healthy, around addressing why people don't get health care, around understanding whether or not people have the means of a dignified life, they all start with a certain kind of politics that I think has been corrupted by the interests of corporations and the fact that we've lost a firewall between our economics and the largesse that some people can make in that system and our political system. And I think the same logic that applies to healing people before they get sick should apply in our politics. And I'm hoping that as a public health physician and as a doctor, we'd be, by the way, the first Democratic doctor elected to the U.S. Senate since 1969, first ever public health official as far as we know, that I hope that I can do something about it.
Oh, so inspiring. I love this whole trajectory and your explanation of the opportunities, I have to say out loud here that I talk to my children about opportunity all the time and not to waste them.
Well, Mila, I'll ask you, I know that you immigrated to this country.
I did.
Did your children ever get to spend some time?
In Indonesia?
Yeah.
Yes. I'm bringing gifts home to Indonesia when I go. And actually, my younger son just went back by himself last year and brought many gifts.
So I
It was
promise
very
you,
different for him to go by himself
Yeah.
for the first time.
and I promise you that that experience will have changed the way he thinks about his American upbringing. You know, I came to understand that my opportunity set was an accident of history. And, you know, people tell you, I was always a good student, sometimes despite myself. People will be like, oh, well, you're smart and you work hard. And I was like, you know, my grandmother was smarter and worked harder. And the sum total of her life is that she raised 6 kids in a 1-bedroom apartment. She was a giant in the family, but most people will never know her story. And so it disabuses you of this idea that you're the one who's special. And I think that was my grandmother's lesson to me, which is the opportunities are special. And there are so many people who never get the opportunities that you get. My cousin, who was, in fact, smarter than me, died in an auto accident at 27. And I got to go to incredible public schools, vaccinated against diseases that killed an aunt and uncle I never got to meet. I got to graduate valedictorian at the University of Michigan. I got to win a Rhodes Scholarship to go to Oxford. I had my medical education paid for by the federal government and the NIH. Those are opportunities my cousins couldn't have dreamed of. Being smart and working hard do not guarantee you those opportunities. And the real question, I think, is whether or not you make your life's work about creating opportunity for people who already have it, or about creating opportunity for people who don't. And I think this work in politics, is really about setting the foundation, right? The field on which all the rest of this happens. But when you know that there are some people who will never, ever get to step on the field, at some point you'll never know what they could have done. And that loss, whether it's because they die before they turn 1, or they're plagued by diseases that should have been prevented, or they never get the health care they need, or they grew up in circumstances where their brain never got the education it deserved, or they couldn't breathe and were, in effect, left at home a day every week because of persistent asthma, or their brain got poisoned with lead, or all of the reasons why people never get to manifest. I think at the end of the day, if we had a government that was thinking about those things, imagine all of the incredible capacity you can unlock. And I think, you know, for your son, the ability to sort of understand that his experience growing up was just not that normal in the grand scheme of the world makes you value the opportunities you get a lot more.
Thank you for framing it this way. You talked a lot just now about opportunities and making these opportunities possible for people at large in the population. And you were introduced to us as the bold progressive running for the open seat for Senate in Michigan because Senator Gary Peters is retiring. And I want to know how you are the progressive candidate as opposed to somebody like Mallory McMorrow, who's also in this race. And some people think of her as being the progressive.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I'm not campaigning to earn the title the progressive. So it's really not of that much importance to me. The question to me is, who is focused most on unlocking a political system that has locked out far too many people? And who is willing to stand up to that system every single place it shows up to rob people of exactly those opportunities? We all ran in 2018. And when we ran, our local utility, DTE, our local health insurance company, Blue Cross, spent a collective $500,000 to beat me. They were also spending money to help elect other folks running in this office. And that is both of my Democratic opponents. So at the end of the day, I've just been consistent about the fact that I think the central format of our corruption sits in the ways that corporations and billionaires can use their wealth to buy politicians to do their bidding. I've never participated in that program, and I never will. And then it's a question about, what do you actually want to do in office? A lot of politicians out there tell you what you cannot have and should not fight for. Medicare for all, well, you know, you can't dream of those things, so let's just do this other thing that would make peace with the fact that corporate health insurance exists and ought to persist and ought to continue to have power. And I'm just never going to make peace with it. So when some folks are fighting for a public option, telling you that that's as much as you can hope for, I actually do believe that you can have Medicare for all. And I say that as somebody who spent a lot of time working in the healthcare system. You watch ICE shoot people in the face or the back of the head, weaponizing a paramilitary force not to enforce immigration law, not to secure a southern border. Minneapolis is quite far away from the southern border, but instead to normalize paramilitary force against the Constitution itself. I went to Minneapolis at the height of Project Metro Surge. I wanted to see what it looks like when a president weaponizes paramilitary forces against a city in our own country. And what I saw was harrowing. And if your conclusion of that is that it can be reformed or that can be retrained, I just don't think you're serious about governing, because I've run government institutions and that kind of culture cannot be reformed or retrained. So to me, the moderate position is you need to abolish ICE and start from scratch. People like to pretend that ICE was like written in the Constitution. ICE is younger than I am. And I'm not afraid to say it. And then, you think about the responsibility that we have when it comes to questions of how you push back, how you protect and defend democracy. And there are some people who go along to get along, and there are some people who recognize that at the end of the day, whether you're standing alone or standing with others, you should stand on principle. So I'm really focused on those things. My job is not to beat another person in an election. We frame it that way. It's kind of annoying. My job is not to sit on some left-right spectrum. Again, that's just a lens that we apply to our politics to help us make sense of it. My job is to build an indelible relationship with the people of the state of Michigan so that they understand exactly what it is that I'm fighting for. There are going to be some people who disagree with me. That's okay. I'm not their candidate. But my belief is that when you actually have the conversations, when you've been to 90 cities, 300 public events, and you're willing to look people in the eye and tell them what you believe, even if they disagree with you, they get a better sense of who you are. And if they do, at least they can map what your principles are relative to your positions. And if there's a consistency there, then they know who you are. And my job is just to show them who I am. And I believe if they see what I'm for and what I'm about, that I'll earn their support in this election, and I'll get the opportunity to serve them for at least 6 years in the U.S. Senate.
Wow, so many questions now. But let's start here, because this is a democracy show. I'm wondering about how you think about reaching potential Democratic voters. You just, said that many of the voters are being ignored, while politicians aren't really addressing their concerns, whether that's rising costs of living or their neighbors being snatched by ICE. And in your mind, what does healthy democratic participation look like then, if you can reach them? Especially the people who have given up. And there are so many. I think if you're in Minnesota, it's really easy to just be cynical.
What I'll tell you is this. You go to Minnesota and more people were activated into democracy because they understood finally what it's like not to have it. I remember being in Egypt and my grandmother telling me I had the unfortunate circumstance of reaching my full height of a gigantic 5'8" at 13 years old. So she told me, look, you're getting old enough, you look old enough, you can't say anything about politics here. And being a bit of an iconoclast, the next time we went down to the market, I used the choice words that my cousins taught me about the then president, Hosni Mubarak. And my grandmother flipped out. She pulls me back. She's like, what are you doing? This is crazy. I was like, I told you can't say anything. I said, well, nobody said anything. I'm good. Until that night, we had plainclothes cops come to the house. And they asked, where's that boy? And my grandfather, who sold vegetables in that market his whole career, like one of the roughest, toughest people you've ever met in your life, I'd never seen him afraid until that moment. He says, go get your passport. So I pull it out of my bag, and he holds it up like an amulet. Right? This is 1998. They left. My U.S. passport protected my freedom of speech 6,000 miles away in Egypt in 1998. The question now is, does that same U.S. passport protect your freedom of speech into 2026? And I think for a lot of people, folks are starting to realize that democracy, like you said, is not a thing that sits in the atmosphere, right? Democracy is a thing you participate in. I think there are three really important parts of democracy. It's the ability to elect your leaders or to vote on legislation. But then it's also freedom of the press, the ability to share a conversation. And then it's also what we call civil society, people coming together and organizing independent of the state and independent of commerce around goals that they have. It's everything from kids' soccer leagues to a book club. And I think we're watching a degradation on those other two in ways that are being pushed, right? Especially now with this administration, but also ways that have been degraded simply because of new ways of communicating. You think about social media, and it's tricked us into thinking that all meaningful interaction has to happen with eyes on a screen rather than eyes on each other. Mm-hmm. And I think all of that has led us to this moment where we have sort of allowed a set of fascist forces to take root. And I think this moment requires us to recognize that democracy is a thing you have to participate in. So you asked me about reaching Democrats, and I'm so inspired because everywhere I go, I am watching people self-organize. You think about the Indivisible movement, you think about 50-51, you think about the No Kings protests. And these are people coming together in acts of civil society that are about organizing around the principles that we want. But then there's that question about freedom of the press. And one of the interesting things is that there have been gatekeepers in our public conversation who have taken for granted that they get to set the frame of the conversation and the debate, that there are some ideas that are not worth discussing and some that are. And sometimes they get it right, and often they get it wrong. And when they get it wrong to great effect. One example of that is the fact that our country has been subsidizing apartheid and more recently genocide in Gaza. And they tell us that we can't have that conversation, and they try to shut it down at every turn. They demonize people who want to have that conversation. But one of the upsides of the new forms of communication is that, you can't really gatekeep in the same way. You and I get to have this conversation in what they call new media, right? And so I happen to believe that if you want a true functioning democracy, that you have to be able to go everywhere and talk to everyone. That means sometimes using gate-kept media. It means sometimes sidestepping gate-kept media. But it always means being willing to engage in a conversation where there are people who are listening to try and demonstrate a way back into a politics that is constructive, that operates through the political channels that we have to be able to beget ends. Anytime you make a political end verboten, what you are doing is pushing people outside of the political process, outside of democracy, and that itself is dangerous for democracy.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're hitting a lot of notes that I want to get into. So let's make it a little bit more granular. We are very cognizant, of course, that democracy is eroding in the United States. And what we sorely need is, in part, not only for Congress to step up and assert its equal branch status alongside the executive. So at the same time, though, I'm also cognizant that the Senate is made up of 100 members. So you're just going to be one of 100. And you have to work super hard to pass legislation. And even then, it might still get vetoed by the president. So how do you envision being anti-authoritarian in this moment in the Senate, one of 100? Do you think about it as passing laws, or do you think about it in different ways?
I think we take the job as being the procedural parts of the job. But when you're an elected official, even when you think about the actual work, there is an official side and then there is a campaign side. And I take very seriously the campaign side. And the reason why is because politics is about persuasion. And I worry that on both sides, Democrat, Republican, pro-authoritarian, fascist, anti-authoritarian, people have taken for granted that you cannot persuade anymore. The authoritarian side actually just wants to force its viewpoint on you. And then unfortunately, too often, the anti-authoritarian side has given up on actually trying to persuade people. And I just haven't. I think that the best thing about this work is to have conversations with people who may disagree with you. Because the only way to get them to agree with you is to be willing to engage in conversation. And so, yes, there is the procedural work. And yes, right now, anti-authoritarians need to be doing everything they can within the matter of procedure to throw sand in the gears so that they do not weaponize government against the democracy itself. But then there's the question of being willing to go and have a persuasive argument with the people who have been duped into supporting the downfall of their own democracy. And that is done by going to places and spaces and engaging in conversations that are probably uncomfortable. And it means that you cannot play this purity politics. You cannot discriminate between different platforms. You've got to go where people are. Because if you want democracy to be our system, you have to funnel people back into democracy. what politicians do is funnel people back into democracy by offering different packages of things that people can support. Elect me and this is what I'm going to work on, right? But when we start saying, actually, those people are not worth talking to, or there's no way you're going to persuade these other people, or you shouldn't talk to that person because somebody's going to make an attack ad out of you because they said something crazy one time, I think you've forgotten the point of democracy. Mm-hmm. So I generally have gone everywhere and talked to everybody. On the same day, I did a rally with Hassan Piker and went on Fox and Friends. Why? Because I'm saying the same thing to everybody, right? And I think my message is compelling. And so I want to persuade people. And that is what democracy is made of.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, you just mentioned earlier also that you have held over 300 public events across 90 cities. What have you discovered from going to these places face to face? What have you heard there that gives you confidence that running a grassroots campaign is the way?
You know, they say you have 2 ears in one mouth. The most important thing I get from my visits to different communities is the opportunity to sit and listen. And I told you about my upbringing. I had this uncommon experience of having to explain one grandmother to the other. So I told you about my one grandmother. My other grandma was my grandma Judy, who raised her 3 kids in a bungalow in the Midwest, who worked as a nurse, trained in Flint. My 2 grandmothers could not have imagined one another's lives, and I got to walk seamlessly between them. And one of the most incredible things about my experience is that when your grandmother kisses you on the forehead, it's the same love. Doesn't matter if she's illiterate, never got to go to school, raised 6 kids in a 1-bedroom apartment in Alexandria, Egypt, or she is a nurse who raised her 3 kids in a bungalow in the Midwest. But I had to explain these people to each other. You couldn't have imagined their lives. And what that teaches you is that the things that matter the most of us share in common. And so for me, people have their stories and they want to share them. And your ability to listen to the stories is dignifying on its own terms. So you have to go and listen. And you want to go and listen because people will tell you what's meaningful to them and how problems manifest. But the other part of that is to recognize that actually a lot of the problems people face are shared. They just show up in different ways. And the problem beyond all of it is that we live such atomized lives that we don't know the problems that one another face. So if you are a poor or working or retired person in a place like Flint, Michigan, or you're a poor working retired person in a tiny little town like Escanaba in the Upper Peninsula, you don't know one another's experience, and nobody has ever carried those experiences between you. And so you think that your problems are being suffered alone, and you don't realize that there's common cause across each of you. So the opportunity to actually carry one another's stories to each other, to be able to reflect on what you're hearing and share between people and become a bridge between people to understand that if you can't afford your home, whether you're in Escanaba or Flint, that's a real problem for you. If you can't afford your groceries, if you're worried that you might get sick because you got a $6,000 deductible, that's a real problem for you. There is power in being able to bring that to each other and recognize that these divisions that they've told us exist actually are only put up by people who never want us to understand that our problems are one and the same, that we really can have nice things, but we can really only do it together. And so that's been the value of it, is that you can really build a bridge by which different people see each other and understand each other and recognize that actually their challenges are one and the same. And the folks who are keeping them from having that have been putting up barriers and telling folks on either side of the barrier that the real problem is that person over there, right? It's like you go up north and people tell you the problem is the people down in Detroit. You go to Detroit, they'll tell you, well, it's those folks up north. Turns out all of us are frustrated because of people in D.C. And that kind of campaigning teaches you something, and it teaches us one another something about each other.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of systems change, we already touched on this very briefly, changing access to healthcare. You literally wrote the book on Medicare for all. And it's not really a surprise that in the United States there aren't a lot of believers. I'll just throw out there that I know lots of people who are interested in Medicare for all as a concept, but everybody, I'm, generalizing. But I think the common feeling is that the insurance companies will prevail to keep the status quo. So how do we get there? How do we achieve Medicare for all? And then what does it look like? Because I think people don't have the imagination or the belief that this can become reality.
The majority of people in poll after poll want it. But you're right. We are so used to watching big corporations dominate our politics that some people have decided that it's not even worth trying. Just this last year alone, our premiums went up 15%. Premiums are just what you pay to have the ability to pay more if you get sick. That comes in the form of a deductible. The median deductible is over $4,000 for a family of four. If you think about the median income, about $80,000, you're talking about a whole single paycheck that you're going to have to pay just because you got sick to get the health care you thought you already paid for with every single paycheck. I think when we used to talk about guaranteeing health care, we always thought about it as a program for poor people. So a lot of people could just be like, well, I'm fine, I have insurance. Today, it's not. It's a program for everybody in the middle class. And people are starting to realize that. Just do some more math here. If you're 60 years old and you're purchasing insurance on the market, you're paying $20,000 in deductibles. So just think about, let's give you $80,000 in salary, which is a pretty good salary. After taxes, you're now at $60,000. After healthcare, you're now at $40,000. Your healthcare is just as much as your taxes, and that's for a plan with a $6,000 deductible. Can't afford it on an $80,000 salary. So I think we get there because a lot of these corporations have overplayed their hand. They've overpicked our pockets. They've gotten too greedy. Things have gotten too expensive, and people are sick of it. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to stop pushing back. That doesn't mean that they're going to stop fear-mongering. Doesn't mean that they're not going to stop spending tons of money to influence our politics. But it does mean that people understand this in a visceral way, and I think we have an opportunity to push that into electoral outcomes. I just want to share what Medicare for All would mean for people. You know, if you are one of these people who has private health insurance, you have some insurance card in your pocket. You probably paid $1,000, $2,000 a month just to have it, you or your employer. And then if you tried to use it, you'd have to pay a deductible to get it. We're early in the year. Most people haven't spent down their deductible. The average deductible doesn't get spent down until about July now. That means that if you get sick, you're not really actually sure that you're going to be able to afford it. Imagine having another card that you get the day you're born that doesn't expire until the day you pass away, God willing, at 120 years old after a long, healthy life, okay? Imagine you don't have to pay a thing for it. If you use it, you don't have to pay a deductible. There is no copay. And it's good wherever you could get your health care. Imagine the security that would offer you. Imagine how many small businesses would get formed because people aren't worried that they might lose their corporate health insurance. Imagine how many people might get out of potentially abusive relationships because they're not worried about losing their insurance. Imagine what it would mean for the people who hold the $225 billion of medical debt. Put that in perspective. That is more than the GDP of half of U.S. states. So I think we need to explain and explain and explain and persuade and persuade and persuade. And I think we have the truth on our sides. So if you got the truth, go fight for it.
Yeah, well, there's no question that corporate capitalism has captured our healthcare system, and that I think it's, first of all, fantastic that you have all of these numbers at your fingertips, because it makes it much easier to explain or for people to imagine the magnitude of some of these issues, or specifically this issue. But there is really so much mistrust that it makes room for people like RFK Jr. to take advantage.
Yeah.
How do you think about, philosophically, the intersection of public health and democracy?
So I'll tell you this. I remember in the height of the pandemic, and I was out in Detroit talking about why people should get vaccinated. And there was a gentleman, he said, Abdul, I've seen you on CNN. I knew you when you were the health director in the city of Detroit. Like, I trust you. And I'm going to get my vaccine. But I do want to ask you something. Like, what's that? He's like, you're working so hard to make sure I take a medication that didn't exist a year ago for a disease I don't have that didn't exist a year ago. I've been on insulin for my whole life. A disease I've had my whole life, a medication that's existed for 100 years, and where are you all to make sure I can afford that? I said, you know what, that's a damn good question, man. I'm so sorry, you're absolutely right. And public health is what we as a society do collectively to assure conditions for people to be healthy. It is a collective act. It requires government to be trusted because we ask people to do things to prevent outcomes that we know are far worse. But when our healthcare system and our government get so corrupted by the power of huge corporations such that we are now undermining trust in the entire pharmaceutical industry, that people can then take and twist. Right? I don't trust Big Pharma, not because they make bad products. It's because they make good products that they make too expensive. But it's not very far to just say, well, maybe they just make bad products too. And that becomes extremely dangerous. When all of society feels like it's trying to pick your pocket, you start to become mistrustful of all of society. And so if we do not regulate the power of corporations and do not regulate the power of corporations in our politics in particular, do not be surprised when people don't trust public goods.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, you have spent many years now being told your politics are too far left to win. For example, Medicare for all, or being a grassroots politician, or being vocal about not funding the genocide in Palestine. And yet I understand, actually, that your polls are showing really well and that you are, really neck and neck in the race. What does this say, you think, about the narrative behind radical candidates across the country? And I don't know whether you would describe yourself as radical. You already mentioned you're not really left-right. You're just going to represent the people of Michigan. But what do you think people are missing when they're saying that?
What is radical in our society is the idea that you allow big, powerful corporations worth trillions of dollars or people worth billions of dollars to get to call the shots for the rest of us. That to me is radical. Like, it's a crazy thing. We're the only country in the world that does it this way. That's a radical thing. What I'm talking about is common sense. I don't want your tax dollars to be misappropriated to drop a bomb on another child or their school or their hospital when it could be spent to invest in your child and their school and their hospital. I don't want a big corporation trying to figure out how to make another billion when you can't afford your groceries. I don't think that in the richest, most powerful country in the world, when countries like Cuba can guarantee healthcare for the people, I don't think it's that hard for us to be able to guarantee it for us. What about this is not common sense? So people will say it's radical because at the end of the day, that system is really quite powerful. And it gets to dictate, go back to where we started, right? It gets to tell you what ideas you can take seriously and what you can't. Gatekeeps around what will be considered okay to talk about. And so I'm so sorry. I just don't think any of these ideas are all that radical. I think they're really quite common sense. And I'm going to keep talking about them. But there is something about this. I've been around for a while. This is not my first time running for office. I ran back in 2018. I was saying the same things then. And I think sometimes what happens is, for those of us who carry these common sense ideas, we drink the Kool-Aid into thinking that we're actually radical. And then there becomes a style about that, which you start to adapt, and you let them trick you into thinking that what you're saying is crazy. And I just am not going to do that. I've been around long enough. At the end of the day, like, everyone's like, well, you can't be serious. I'm like, well, I was serious enough to spend 4 years learning medicine. I think if you don't think I'm serious about this, I just don't think you're serious, right? Because I've actually done the serious part. So I have enough confidence in what I'm saying to keep coming and talking about it. And I'm going to keep coming and talking about it. And over time, when people get used to you talking about it, they start to actually listen to what you're saying. And again, what I'm saying is not particularly radical. It's kind of common sense. And so people are starting to listen and they're starting to think about it. And the thing about it is, I got the truth on my side. Last time I ran, I said, look, Donald Trump is not himself the disease. He's just the worst symptom of the disease. And now, 8 years on, groceries are less affordable. It's harder to afford a home. You are worried about losing your job to a robot. The air you breathe is less pure. The water you drink is less pure. Your kid's school didn't get an upgrade. It looks even older than it did last time. So ask yourself, is what I'm saying consistent with what your experience has been or not? And if it is consistent with what your experience has been, I'm trying to tell you what I want to do to fix. And if it's not, cool, good for you. I'm not going to earn your vote. That's okay with me. But I'm taking a bet that the persistence on the truth is in the end what creates better outcomes. And maybe I say that as a doctor.
Yeah, I appreciate the straight talk. 2 more questions. Every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. What is your advice for people who want to turn the insights that you have shared with us into action?
Have a conversation with somebody you disagree with that is not intermediated by a screen, where you can see the whites of their eyes, and make that conversation, if it's easy, about something you agree on. But what I think the curriculum of the social media age has led us to is a world in which we think we cannot talk to people we disagree with, and a world in which we think the most meaningful interactions are intermediated by a screen, and neither of those things are true. We share more in common with the people we disagree with than we have apart. And when we find those things, I think it becomes a lot easier to find more points of agreement and to tolerate disagreement. And I think that it is fundamental to our democracy to be able to do that, right? Democracy is the process by which we solve disagreements peacefully. And that means you're going to have to tolerate people you disagree with. But if we lost the muscle to do that, I worry a lot about how that goes. I'll also tell you that like some of the most joyful moments you will share are those moments in which you are just shooting the shit with somebody about something that is completely not important. And if you can share that moment of joy, that little like dopamine surge that you feel when you're having a great conversation with somebody, you're instantly closer to that person. It makes it a lot easier than to like, all right, let's get into the harder part, right? But you build that trust, right? Like if this person loves their dog and I love my dog, like it can't be that bad, right? If this person roots for my team, right? We can't have that much apart, even if there are a lot of things that you don't share. You know, I've experienced my fair share of hate. And I always try to find the thing that I share in common, because part of my job is to show somebody that I'm human too, right? The end outcome of hatred is to try and dehumanize people. And the thing I always say is like, hey, you like a good steak, I like a good steak. Why? Because we're both people. So I hope that folks can do that.
Yeah, well said. So looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
I got 2 little girls, 8 and 3. And, you know, they're essentially good. You know, it's hard to believe a lot of the narratives in the world when you think about the fact that like all kids are good. You know, sometimes they do dumb stuff, but they're good. Like they're good. They want good. And all of us want good for our kids. So I'm reminded of that every day. You know, most everybody I talk to is asking me about the state of the race. You know who does not ask me about the state of the race? My girls. They want to read a book. They want to go play soccer. They, you know, want to cuddle. They want to talk about their favorite thing that has nothing to do with this race. And it just reminds me that like we actually all kind of want to keep a hallowed space for that. So that gives me a lot of hope. And I think if we can all dial in to what we want for our children and then recognize that collectively we want that for all of our children, I think we make much better decisions in the world.
Yes, here. Totally agree. Well, Abdul, thank you so much for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Privilege was mine. Thank you for the important work you're doing. I'm really grateful and hope that folks who are compelled by anything I said, check us out on social media, abdulforsenate.com if you'd like to get involved.
Thank you. Dr. Abdul El-Sayed has dedicated his career to making government work for all Michiganders and is a candidate for U.S. Senate in the state of Michigan. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. First, have a conversation with someone you disagree with and do it in person. Despite what social media has been trying to teach us, we can, in fact, speak to one another about things that we disagree on. And the craziest thing? You might just find something you do agree on. Thanks so much for listening and tuning in to Future Hindsight. If you want to support the show, please subscribe to the channel and leave us a like on the video. A little action goes a long way. Thank you.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.